Hi, my name is Dr. Jason Lepojärvi. Welcome to a lecture series on C.S. Lewis on love. C.S. Lewis was one of the most influential intellectuals, authors of the 20th century. I'm a former president of the Oxford University C.S. Lewis Society, and I also did my doctorate on his theology of love and philosophy of love. It was called God is Love, but Love is Not God, Studies on C.S. Lewis's Theology of Love. You can find it for free online. As you can see, if you look closely, my daughter has signed my only copy, so thank you. C.S. Lewis on love. Our first lecture will be a preliminary one. We'll be asking some fundamental questions that will help us as we explore love in the 20th century further. Call this lecture The Nature of Love. One of the many charitable arguments C.S. Lewis had with his best friend, Arthur Greeves, was about love. This is a picture of Lewis in his late teens. C.S. Lewis disagreed with Arthur's formulaic theory that love equals friendship plus sensual feelings. Not so, thought Lewis. Rather, love apart from physical feelings was quite different to friendship. These are quotes from the letters. Lewis continues, the one is calm and easygoing satisfaction, the other a sort of madness. We take possession of the one, the other takes possession of us. Not bad for a 17-year-old boy. Ever since boyhood, Lewis was drawn to love. He had an inquisitive dalliance with love. Lewis continues in another letter. You ask me whether I have ever been in love. Fool as I am not quite such a fool as all that. But though I have no personal experience of the thing they call love, I have what is better, the experience of Sappho, of Euripides, of Catullus, of Shakespeare, of Spencer, of Austen, of Bronte, of anyone else I have read. We see through their eyes. Accordingly, we have every right to talk about it. A little defensive, perhaps. As Lewis matured in years and perhaps in letter writing, he would not only experience love and talk about love, but also, what is rarer and bolder, write books, academic books and public books about love. In fact, love became arguably the central motif or the lion's share of his versatile literary output. The Allegory of Love from 1936 was his entry into serious scholarship. He made his name among the ranks of serious scholars with this work. Poems like Old Poets Remembered or Love's as Warm as Nails are about love. The latter, Love's as Warm as Nails, is positively heartbreaking. I encourage you to listen to the recording of it put into song by the composer Paul Milor, who also composed Ubi Caritas for the royal wedding some years ago. The Great Divorce from 1945 mentions the word love a whopping 74 times. Love, do you know the meaning of the word? Love, how dare you use that sacred word, as one of the pitiable characters says. And then there's Till We Have Faces and the Four Loves, which can be thought of as a pair. These are among my favorites. The, the first one, Till We Have Faces, although it was published a few years before The Four Loves, it embodies in literary forms, exemplifies in a story the more philosophical and psychological analysis of love in The Four Loves. I happen to have a copy of the first edition to The Four Loves, which I found in an old, dingy, dusty bookshop in Oxford. Probably the first reviewer, the first person to review The Four Loves in 1960 was Vigo Demant, who was an Oxford professor. And in his review, he saw the potential in The Four Loves, which was more popular in style. He said that it could help readers confused by the more ponderous treatments of love by Nygren, de Rougemont, and Father Darcy. Now, who are these? Father Martin Darcy was a philosopher, a Jesuit philosopher from Oxford, and he had written a pretty dense treatise on, philosophically dense treatise on love called The Mind and Heart of Love from 1945. It's not clear whether Lewis ever read Darcy's book, but Darcy did read Lewis's book, as we will see. The other person mentioned in Demant's list is Anders Nygren, who was a Lutheran bishop and probably with Lewis among the top 4 or 5 most influential Christian scholars of love. And in fact, Lewis kind of reacted against Nygren's portrayal of love. It is clear that Lewis not only read Nygren, but was influenced by Nygren. And now we know that The Four Loves was in large part written to correct Nygren and to provide an antidote to readers who have had either directly or indirectly been influenced by Nygren's model in Eros and Agape. And then finally, Denis de Rougemont, who I believe is a Swiss philosopher and political theorist. Lewis did read de Rougemont's book L'amour et l'Occident, which was published as Love in the Western World in English. Lewis read it in the original French. And de Rougemont as well motivated Lewis to tackle love in a more philosophical, careful manner. Nygren's influence was mostly negative. De Rougemont's influence was mostly positive. In fact, one of the guiding stars in The Four Loves, the idea that love begins to be a demon the moment it begins to be a god. So when you worship love, it turns sour on you, is an idea that Lewis took directly from de Rougemont. Michael Ward in C.S. Lewis at the Poet's Corner says that for Lewis, love informs the entire cosmos. And if Michael Ward is right, it would explain why Lewis thought so much about love, talked about love, read about love, argued about love, reviewed books on love, and wrote so much about love. We could playfully even say that there's reason to believe that Lewis was in love with love somehow. I've divided this lecture into 2 parts. The first part will ask and answer the first question. The second part will ask and answer the second and the third question. But we have to set the stage first for all 3. By the end of this lecture, I hope we will have successfully recalculated the number of loves and captured the essence of love, love itself, and finally understood what exactly Lewis meant by the so-called fourth love, charity. I believe there's a popular misconception that needs to be corrected. I will argue in this first part of this lecture that there aren't four loves, and Lewis probably never meant it to be. First, the prehistory of the four loves. So what happened until we actually had the physical book? Well, the prehistory of the four loves starts in America. And some say all history starts in America, but I'm agnostic on that point. The Radio TV Foundation of Atlanta, Georgia, contacted Lewis and asked him if he would be interested in giving a series of radio talks on his chosen subject. Now, Lewis replies immediately, and he says, yes, basically. And the subject I want to say something about in the near future, in some form or another, is the four loves, storge, philia, eros, and agape. This seems to bring in nearly the whole of Christian ethics. Would this be suitable for your purpose? Lewis also explains that he would tackle his subject love on the popular level, not, as the four words suggest, philologically. This popular level would secure popularity of the work. There's no analysis of the talks that I know of, except one that looks at the rhetorics at play. But I'll just mention two puzzling facts, two puzzling differences between the radio talks and the book. First of all, the radio talks begin directly from affection, the first of the four loves, whereas the book has added two chapters to the beginning before the first of the four loves, affections, is introduced. And as a result, the talks omit a lot of the good stuff, a lot of the subhuman love of animals, love of country, the sagacious distinction between what Lewis calls nearness by approach and nearness by likeness, and so on. The second puzzling fact, the puzzling difference between the two, is that whereas the talks use the word agape for the fourth love, the book uses the word charity for the fourth love. And one could say that, well, isn't charity just an English translation of the Latin caritas, which is the Latin translation of the Greek agape? So isn't charity and agape basically the same thing? I don't think so. I think Lewis chose charity for the book precisely because he wanted to correct the Neugrenian misunderstanding of agape that his readers had adopted. So Lewis makes up his own vocabulary to get a clean slate, so to speak. But more of that later. The hiccups, the problems that they experienced in the recording of the talks, the radio talks, are well known. Well, for example, the representative of the foundation was a lady by the name of Caroline Rakestraw, and Lewis could never remember her name. He would always call her Mrs. Cartwheel. Lewis didn't like Mrs. Rakestraw's request for Lewis to, at the beginning of the recording, to sit still quietly so that his American audience might feel Lewis's living presence. Lewis thought that that was a bit silly. But the worst of all came when the board of bishops of this foundation, when they heard the recordings, they pulled the plug on the whole project. They didn't want to air it nationally after all. And it fell to Mrs. Rakestraw to explain to Lewis why this is so. And According to Lewis's wife, Joy, Mrs. Rakestraw had explained that Professor Lewis, I'm afraid that in your talk on Eros, you brought in the subject of sex. And apparently Lewis had replied, my dear Mrs. Cartwheel, how can you talk about Eros and leave it out? He found it mind-boggling that the country that already in the 50s and 60s produced the most pornography in the world could not stomach a Christian discussion on sex. By the way, I've added links to the handouts for both part 1 and part 2 of this lecture if you want to see the general outline and the structure. The hiccups involved in the radio recording production are well known, but the hiccups involved in the book editing process are not well known. Lewis's editors thought that the work was seriously marred by what we feel are flaws in his arguments. For example, what was the difference between a mere human relationship and love? They felt that the distinction was left too porous, too vague. Or what was the distinction, the difference between friendship love and mere alliances? So they sent Lewis a long list of corrections, and he replied, I think Milton and you were being rather bat's-eyed in some places, but to the point in others. And he makes some modifications. Except when they critique Lewis that in his discussion of the love of Eros, Eros becomes personified almost. And Lewis responds point by point to all the requests, and to this Eros critique, he just says, tut, tut. He wasn't impressed. Apparently, he thought as an author, he had literary liberties to personify his loves if he wanted to. Well, Lewis's editors were right. They would not be the only ones who would pick up on some of the problems in the book. His reviewers picked up on some of the problems as well, except one, V.A. Demand. His review was almost entirely positive. But the review of Bernard Williams, for example, a famous philosopher, at the time he was a young scholar, was critical. He knew Lewis personally. He said in his review that The Four Loves it commits an almost willed superficiality, or Lewis is acting dumb, basically. And also, there are outbreaks of padre talk. A padre is a military chaplain, and military chaplains sometimes might indulge in coarse language to kind of acquire street credibility among the blokes. Now, there are instances of coarse language, profanities in Lewis's pre-conversion diary, but it's very unlikely that he would swear 30 years after his conversion is when The Four Loves was written. Martin Darcy, who was mentioned earlier, he says, so absorbing is the description of these loves that one's critical faculties are lulled to sleep. In afterthought, certain questions arise and doubts remain. The most important of these questions that arose in Darcy's mind, we return to soon. Finally, the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, who also was a young student, or he had just begun his career as a scholar. He wasn't the student at age 30 anymore, but it was one of his first book reviews that he ever published. He wrote in his very short review that Professor Lewis, the perceptive and learned critic of medieval and Renaissance literature, has here been completely defeated by Mr. Lewis, the arch and patronizing lay theologian. Ouch. Interestingly, Lewis felt that some of the positive reviews were much worse. For example, one priest wrote a, um, a praising review, and Lewis comments on it in a letter that, oh, the man misunderstands me so deeply. So he didn't want to be praised for what he thought was misunderstandings. But it seems to me that Lewis himself is at least partly to blame for some of the most widespread misunderstandings about the four loves. And arguably the most popular misunderstanding pertains to the number of loves. Blake's Seven was a British science fiction TV production in the late 19s, early 80s. Over the course of its 4 seasons, some actors left, others were replaced. Here you see Blake in the center with 4 of his 7. But at the end of season 4, there was no Blake. And there weren't 7 of them. Something similar has happened to my understanding of this book, The Four Loves. There aren't 4 loves. And they're not even love. The 4 that are mentioned here are not even love. I mean, it's a beautiful title, The Four Loves, but it's entirely misleading. Sometimes Lewis does speak as if there are literally 4 loves, not 3, not 5, but 4. For example, in a letter to a friend, he writes, "It, charity love, is called agape in the New Testament to distinguish it from eros, sexual love, storge, family affection, and philia, friendship. So there are 4 kinds of love, all good in their proper place." But Caroline Simon, who is an American scholar, Caroline Simon does not take Lewis at his word. She looks more critically at the Four Loves, and in her piece in the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis, she says this: "There are several taxonomies found in the Four Loves. For example, quote, 1. Love for the subpersonal versus love for the finite persons versus love for God. 2, another way to categorize love in the Four Loves, natural love versus supernatural love. That's a distinction in the book. 3, need love versus gift love versus appreciative love. 4, affection versus friendship versus eros versus charity." So the Four Loves is actually a lot more complicated and messy than one would suppose. And in fact, Caroline Simon reminds readers of the fact that over and over again in the Four Loves, Lewis uses a very interesting analogy or a metaphor. He says that we shouldn't murder, that when we look at love and create all these taxonomies and categories, we almost murder to dissect. We kind of kill our object of study. And we should be mindful of this fact that these are just words, that love doesn't really collapse perfectly into these categories. Rather, these categories are intellectual tools, if you will, that help us dig deeper into our object of study. Think of the unfortunate frog in a science class, at least in decades past, that was cut open and dissected, murdered to dissect. And you learned interesting things about its limbs and organs, and you can name them and codify them. But in the process, you kill the frog. And we must not do that to love. This is Lewis himself warning his readers, although he does dissect his object of study, love. The radio talks begin with this very short sentence. In Greek, there are 4 words for love. Notice, 4 words for love, not 4 loves. This is blunt and revealing. I think he chose this fourfold category from Greek as a pedagogical tool for pedagogical purposes, not to be taken literally. If he had been writing in English, the book might be called One Love. In Finnish, maybe Mute Love. And if recent studies of the Greek language are correct, perhaps it should have been called Six Loves, with added chapters on pragma and mania. Storge, philia, and eros are the first so-called natural loves. Now, my argument is that they are not in themselves loves at all. Rather, they're best seen as love's arena, the place where love proper can take place. Love's arena are various human relationships paired with particular emotions. As basic human relationships, these 3 natural loves provide the space for love proper to occur, the context. Love can happen in relationships. And as the fuel or as feelings, these 3 can add fuel, can motivate us to love. They provide the energy and the motivation, but they're not love itself, not love proper. And so I slightly disagree with Caroline Simon when she says that when Lewis describes these 3 natural loves as mere feeling, it shouldn't be interpreted literally. I tend to think that maybe it should. For example, take affection. Now, this affection is best understood as a feeling or a relation between family members or people who know each other well and spend time with each other at the workplace or at hobbies or wherever. Key here is familiarity, as the 4 Loves says, and I quote, "The child will love a crusty old gardener who has hardly ever taken notice of it, and shrink from the visitor who is making every attempt to win its regard." We've all seen this take place. The first chapter, or the chapter on Storge, describes this love as homely, comfortable, quiet nature of the feeling. Only let affection pour over us like a warm shower bath, and all, it is implied, will be well. But it will not. Because why? The mere feeling is not enough. And I think the same applies to philia. It's best understood as an occasion, the arena for love proper to happen, possibly. Not many people regard it as a love, and Lewis notices this too. And I think really that in isolation of love proper, what Lewis calls friendship, too, is a specific relation or a feeling. The only time he kind of tries to argue that it's love indirectly is when he asks the reader to suppose that they're fortunate enough to have fallen in love with their friend and married their friend. And then they had to make a choice between one or the other, give up the friendship or give up the romance. And he asks rhetorically, which choice should we not regret after we had made it? Oh, we would regret both. But this does not prove in itself that friendship is the same as love. It just shows that it's a valuable thing. Now, I'm not saying that Lewis's friendship cannot become love. I believe it can, but it needs something added to it. And Eros, the last of the three natural loves, I think it's the most obvious example of these so-called natural loves being love's arena, human relationships and feelings, not love itself. Just look at the way this love is described in this chapter. It's called a state. It's a complex state, a desire, an emotion. It is in us. The lovers expected that mere feeling would do for them and permanently all that was necessary. And they're disappointed time and time again. Obviously, Eros is not a virtue, it's rather ambivalent and fleeting. Lewis says that the world rings with complaints of his fickleness. And finally, agape, even the fourth one, when it looks back at the first three types of love, storge, friendship, and eros, it calls them mere feeling. It calls them human activities. And it uses this beautiful garden analogy to illustrate the point that natural loves provide space and fuel for love, but are not love itself. So a garden provides space and fuel for beauty, but a garden will not prune its own fruit trees. The three first types of love are also described as the general fabric of our earthly loves, with its affections and relationships. Affections and relationships, or feelings and relationships. Now, in this sense, Lewis could have spoken of 12 loves or 24 loves, because obviously there are more kinds of human relationships than just three or four. There are almost innumerable kinds of relationships between coworkers and so on that aren't listed here. If you want to be more specific, just give a name for each of the relationships and call it a love, and you could write a book on the 100 loves. So how many loves are there then? And I argue that just one. There's one love that can take a variety of forms, that can enter many kinds of human relationships, and also perhaps relationships between human and animals, and humans and country, subhuman objects of love. This concludes part one of this lecture, and part two begins with the obvious question then, well, what is love exactly? What is love itself? I'll reveal right here that I don't think it is the fourth love. It is not charity in the four loves. Charity means something different. We can dissect a frog, if we absolutely insist on it, and codify its various limbs and its various organs and learn quite a bit about the frog. The one thing we won't learn, though, no matter how many legs and organs we have on display, is the meaning of frog itself. What is a frog? Similarly, we could divide and name pieces of furniture. Think of a sofa, a chair, a desk, a rocking chair, a lantern, an overpriced piece of Tiffany, or whatnot. But what does this tell us about furniture? We still don't know what furniture is. Similarly, a family could have a mother, a father, a son and daughter. But what is family itself? What is the definition of family? And so the family of loves, no matter how many types of loves we have, begs the question, what is love itself? What is the common denominator of all these so-called types of love? The interesting thing about the four loves is that if you comb its pages for an answer to this question, you will come empty-handed. Nowhere does Lewis define love itself in this book, which is very peculiar because he is generally a careful philosopher who defines his terms. So what's up? Something odd is going on. On one hand, it's certainly safer to speak about modes of love and elements of love and types of love instead of offering a one clear cut definition for love itself. Many people do that. I just read a book a couple of days ago that refused to define love. So it's certainly safer, and there's some wisdom in this method. But I don't think that explains its omission in the four loves. And I'm not the first one to notice that the four loves does not define love. Do you remember Martin Darcy, who talked about the critical faculties lulled asleep? That Lewis writes so well that certain questions might that do arise and doubts remain if you're paying extra careful attention. I think this is very perceptive. And this bit I found was Darcy's most perceptive observation. By distinguishing four loves and including so much under each, interest is kept up. But the meaning of love itself risks being vague and fluid. Spot on. Caroline Simon, in her piece in the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis, puts it in Aristotelian language. Lewis never gives us an explicit definition of the genus of which the various loves could be considered candidate species. So the genus species distinction is from Aristotle. There's a problem with defining anything. On one hand, you don't want it to be too rigid. On another hand, you don't want your definition to be too loose. Just think of a bar of soap. There's two ways to drop a bar of soap, whether you're in a prison or not. One way is to squeeze it too hard, to try and pin it down too rigidly, and it'll fall. The opposite way of dropping or losing your bar of soap is not to grip it tightly enough, to have a loose limp, a loose grip. That too will drop it. Similarly with defining words, you need to define them carefully, but not necessarily too rigorously. or your definition will lose its helpfulness. In Lewis's book, The English Literature in the 16th Century, or the Oxford History of English Literature, called Oh Hell by Friends, when he talks about Shakespeare's love sonnets, he says, and this is interesting, he talks about the simply love, the quintessence of all loves, whether erotic, parental, filial, amicable, or feudal. He doesn't define it, but this in itself kind of reveals to us that Lewis is aware of the question of having to define the genus of love. Even though he doesn't provide it, he knows that it is an important question. What is simply love? What is the quintessence of love? And so he had no excuse to leave it out of the four loves. At least he doesn't explain to us why he did leave it out. And notice, by the way, the list here. How many loves does he list in this quotation? 5. The quintessence of love literally means the essence of 5. And so this too kind of shows to us that the division of love into 4 types is just one among many pedagogies an author could take. There has been attempts to define love in Lewis's works. The most influential one is from an American scholar called Gilbert Mailander. He's an ethicist, a theologian. He was the ethical advisor to a former US president. And in his book, The Taste for the Other, the social and ethical thought of C.S. Lewis, he says that spread across Lewis's works are many formulations that sound like definitions of love. And he's found 3 kinds of formulations that sound like definitions of love in Lewis's works. Love as self-giving, love as self-sacrifice, and love as wishing the neighbor's good. For various reasons, Mailander himself prefers the first one, love as self-giving. If he had to choose one to portray Lewis's understanding, he would choose the first one, love as self-giving. And so love becomes, and this is Mailander's attempt at defining love for Lewis, love becomes a relation among persons which, overcoming the recalcitrant claims of self, can generate and maintain a community of vicariousness and reciprocity. Certainly not something that you could unproblematically drop into the smooth flow of Lewis's own prose. It's rather jerky, but it's not unhelpful. It's pretty perceptive. It's pretty clear. Recalcitrant means basically stubborn. Vicariousness means that something lives off another, is organically dependent on the other. But it's perhaps too technical to be memorable, too technical to be helpful. Caroline Simon offers 2 critiques. She says that this formulation, this attempt to define love, on one hand, it lacks need love, which is important for Lewis. And on the other hand, it lacks animal love, it kind of leaves out loving relations between humans and animals and other objects, because it's a relation among persons. And the latter comment, I think, is perceptive. I mean, Lewis does take love for other beloveds in addition to human beloveds quite seriously. So whatever our definition of love is, it should be able to some extent incorporate non-human objects of love as well. I think the comment about this lacking need love is less serious, because even the word reciprocity itself kind of invites a response. But that's a sidetrack. So what is love? I'll try to offer my definition. and see what you think of it. Whatever love is, whatever the genus of love is, whatever love itself is, whatever the essence of love is, it needs to fulfill certain criteria. Above all, it needs to be the common denominator of all forms of love, something that all forms of love share. And it needs to be more than a feeling, not less than a feeling, but more than a feeling. It cannot simply be a feeling. And it also needs to be open to a return, not demand a return of love, but open to a return, almost hope for a return of love. It needs to be responsive somehow. A love that is invulnerable is not really love. And fourth, it needs to be offered to some extent, or able to be offered to some extent, to impersonal objects too, whether they're one's country or animals or wine or whatever. And finally, whatever it is, it should turn mere human relationships into love relationships. It should be that thing that justifies us calling a human relationship and thinking of a mere human relationship or an acquaintance as more than just a relationship, as a love relationship. Now, I already said that I don't think that love is charity, that the missing key is charity in the four loves. That's something else. Rather, this is my suggestion. Love in the four loves is the appreciative and responsive commitment to the other's flourishing. The appreciative and responsive commitment to the other's flourishing. The other could be anything or anyone. And it's almost the kind of the totality of the three elements of love, what Lewis calls three elements of love: need love, gift love, and appreciative love. The stuff that he added to the book that were missing from the radio talks. This is love itself. And it can enter into human relationships, into types of love, and kind of elevate them into love. The appreciative, so love of appreciation, responsiveness, need love, commitment, gift love. I think this formulation captures all three. The other's flourishing is a holistic concept that includes material well-being, spiritual well-being, psychological well-being, whatever the beloved genuinely needs, requires to exist and to exist well. Well, it's a suggestion. Like all definitions, you could do two things to it. On one hand, you could either compress it, tighten the grip of the bar soap. On another hand, compress it in the sense that make it less technical, not actually tighten your grip, but to loosen it, to not be so specific. That's one way to modify definitions. And the other way to modify definitions is to expand it, to make it more precise. In other words, kind of tighten the definition a little bit. So if we remove, for example, this bit, if we condense the definition to love is and commitment to the other's flourishing, what then? I think we could do this. In a way, the appreciative and the responsive bits are superfluous. They're redundant. They're self-evident in a way, if you think about it, because the other's flourishing will, by necessity, require your posture towards them to be one of appreciative and responsiveness. Um, if they feel that you don't appreciate them and that you are closed from them and you are not interested, you're doing all these good things to them, but you're not interested in a return, you kind of remain secure and safe and protected against the other person, it won't contribute to their flourishing as much as an appreciative and responsive posture would. So, in a way, within that word flourishing is already the assumption that true flourishing requires appreciation and responsiveness from the lover. Um, but we could also do the opposite. We could, instead of compressing it, we could extend it, make it more precise, and we could add something to it. We could say that love is the appreciative and responsive commitment insofar as possible and permissible. Excuse me. Sorry, excuse me. There we go. Insofar as possible and permissible to the other's flourishing. Okay, well, why? Why add insofar as possible and permissible? Well, as a qualification to remind us that we're finite, limited human beings with limited resources, limited time, limited energy. And there's only so much we can do in a given context. There's only so much commitment and investment at our disposal. So it's an important qualification that helps us to also protect ourselves insofar as possible. What about insofar as permissible? Well, that qualification reminds us that not everything is appropriate in love. For example, not everything genuinely contributes to the other's flourishing. Not everything is permissible in love. In some contexts, in some relationships, for example, sexual acts might contribute to the other's flourishing. But in others, they might downright be disastrous. They might be a crime. And so these are important qualifications. I think it would be justified to expand this definition like this. And the Four Loves does make these sort of provisos, these sort of qualifications or caveats. For example, the Four Loves says that love, we love so far as a higher love permits. The reference here is God's kind of commandments. We cannot sin in love. For example, in one of his letters, he says that love is acting for the real interests or the real flourishing of that thing in every person, which says I and me, as far as you can, as far as you can, recognizes that there is only so much we can do sometimes. And in another letter, Lewis says that love is not affectionate feeling, but a steady wish for the loved person's ultimate good, as far as it can be obtained. As far as that it can be obtained. So these provisos and qualifications, they relate to my extended version of the definition. Notice here, by the way, that steady wish. Steady implies acquired virtue, something more stable and permanent, not a transient flush or a transient flash of desire, eros, or a pang of conscience, but something more stable. For various reasons, although both the extension and the compression of the definition would be justifiable, for various reasons, I prefer this. I like how it is. I think it strikes a fine balance between neither too rigid nor too flexible. The grip is neither crushing nor is it limp. Whatever we define definitions require drawing a line somewhere. We cannot go on defining forever ad infinitum, but we need to kind of expand our definitions enough to make it helpful. And I think I found this pretty helpful personally. And this is the definition that I offer to you, and you can test it and use it as a sounding board as you yourself try to come up with your own definitions, possibly. I think mere relationships deserve to be called love relationships when we can turn to the other, to the possible beloved, whether they are family or friend or foe, and say that it is good that you exist. I will involve myself in your well-being, and I welcome your love in return. This is what I love you means, whether we know it or not, I believe. So how do we succeed in this is the next big question. This is a lofty ideal. How do we pull it off? I think here charity steps in. Charity rightly understood. Notice, by the way, the connection between the definition of love and the unpacking of I love you here. The appreciative element is the beginning. That's the whole starting point of love. It's good that you exist, but it's taken further than that because you want to commit to the other person's existence, not just existence, but happy existence. So I involve myself in your well-being. And finally, it's not closed, it's not invulnerable, but it's open, it's receptive, it's responsive. The commitment is responsive. And finally, I welcome your love in return. I don't demand it as a prerequisite, as a condition for my love. I'll love you if and only if you love me back. No, but I do hope for it and I welcome it. But what is charity? What is charity in the Four Loves? Notice the cigarette in Lewis's hand. Lewis was a chain smoker for much of his life. And in one of his books called Miracles, he talks about smoking to illustrate some point. And the Japanese, I believe it was the Japanese translator, the publisher of the Japanese edition to Miracles, wrote to Lewis to ask whether they could leave it out, leave the reference to cigarettes out to kind of protect their readers. And Lewis replied that they may not, but they may, as publisher, publish a warning in the footnote, a warning for readers to abstain from excessive cigarette smoking. But in his defense, I mean, everyone smoked back then, so it wasn't wrong. But charity, or agape, whatever, is the most misunderstood of the four loves in the book Four Loves, I believe. It has been suggested, and this is the most popular misunderstanding, I believe, is that Nygren's definition of agape fits Lewis's definition of charity given in the Four Loves. I believe this is the most widespread misunderstanding of charity. And even if you don't know about Nygren's technical definitions, the idea behind it is pretty clear. It's the idea that agape is some kind of divine heavenly solvent that is poured down from heaven and somehow replaces our imperfect earthly loves. Now, I don't think that is what charity is in this book. It's not an abstract heavenly solvent. Rather, it's more practical. It's more mundane. It's even, I'd say, more secular. It is character. Charity is character, the unity of virtues in the four loves. It's right there on the very first page of the last chapter, charity. Listen to this. This is how Lewis begins his final chapter. William Morris wrote a poem called Love is Enough, and someone is said to have reviewed it briefly in the words, "It isn't." Such has been the burden of this book. The natural loves are not self-sufficient. Something else, at first vaguely described as decency and common sense, but later revealed as goodness, and finally, as the whole Christian life in one particular relation, must come to the help of the mere feeling if the feeling is to be kept sweet. In other words, if something must come to the help of the so-called natural loves, if they are to be counted as genuine love and last. And Lewis also reveals what that something is: decency and common sense, um, reason. If you read the four loves with this interpretative key in mind, you'll notice how time and time again in every chapter, reason, moral principles, decency, common sense, justice, and other virtues which comprise character appear. Just one example from the chapter on affection. And those of you who have this edition of the Four Loves, it's on pages 70 to 71. At the very end of this chapter on affection, Lewis writes, affection produces happiness if and only if there is common sense and give and take and decency. In other words, only if something more and other than affection is added. The mere feeling is not enough. You need common sense, that is reason. You need give and take, that is, you need justice. Continually stimulating mere affection when it fades and restraining it when it forgets or would defy the art of love. You need decency. There's no disguising the fact that this means patience, that this means goodness. Patience, self-denial, humility, and the continual intervention of a far higher sort of love than affection in itself can ever be. In his essay, We Have No Right to Happiness, which we will be studying in a different lecture, the last essay that was published, that he wrote, that was published, I think, a month after his death, Lewis says something very similar, something strikingly similar. When two people achieve lasting happiness, this is not solely because they are great romantic lovers, but because they are also, I must put this crudely, good people, controlled, loyal, fair-minded, mutually adaptable people. Notice the breakdown of character into this unified list of virtues. A good lover displays these virtues in eminence. As a younger man in the book, The Allegory of Love, which we mentioned earlier, he captures this in a one-liner. The virtues of a good lover were indistinguishable from those of a good man, meaning a good person. And this is actually Lewis's mature understanding of a good lover. Simply put, a good person. Good lovers are good people. This is at least one of the most succinct definitions of a good lover I've ever heard. It's certainly quite compact, but I'm pretty persuaded by it. It seems to me quite realistic. It follows, it's not just a beautiful thought. It has an internal logic. It may sound unsexy, it may sound moralistic, but if it's true, then it's the only thing that's sexy, because everything that's untrue, every false or misconstrued or distorted view of love or a good lover will ultimately end in heartbreak. And there's nothing sexy in heartbreak. Just think about it. Love, as we've defined it, the appreciative and responsive commitment to the beloved's flourishing, love depends on character. You cannot have this without character. You cannot display it without character. You cannot manifest love without character, which means you cannot do it without virtues which make character. Every virtue, every kind of moral muscle, if you will, has a role to play in the perfection of love. Think about the virtue of humility. This arouses our appreciation of others because we're not just self-centered. Think about the virtue of courage. Sometimes the other's flourishing goodness requires us to take a risk to defend them. Say someone's name is being dragged through the mud online. Only the courageous will step up and risk their own name being dragged through the mud. So a courageous friend will be a better lover than a friend who lacks or has somehow deficient courage. Think of the virtue of loyalty or faithfulness in a romantic relationship. You know, take a perfect romance and subtract from it the virtue of faithfulness, and it collapses. That's how integral these individual vices can be in love relationships. Take out the virtue of patience and so on, of justice and so on, or the virtue of wisdom or prudence, because how do we know what is good for the beloved? How do we know what their flourishing genuinely requires? How does a parent know what the child needs? How does the wife know what the husband needs, and so on? Only the wise lover who has studied humanity in general, but studied this particular person attentively, knows what they need and how to best express one's love and commitment to the other's well-being. So it's obvious that perfect character is an ideal that is unattainable, but I don't think it's a discardable ideal for anyone who wants to become a serious lover. One final thing. This is too important not to mention. And those of you who have watched my lectures or taken classes with me know what this final thing is. Did you spot the fallacy, the deliberate mistake in argumentation that I committed in this lecture? To be more precise, I committed two fallacies, one in part 1 of the lecture and the other in part 2 of the lecture. And they are listed among these 20 most common fallacies. What were they? Make sure you find out somehow, for otherwise you may have adopted and accepted a faulty argument. Bye-bye.